Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first W12 Plus exchange of the year, Changing What's Possible for Urban Water Resilience. My name is Judy Jane. I am the Water Communications Associate with W12 Plus, and I'm so happy to get our exchange started. W12 Plus is a movement of motivated organizations that connect, catalyze, and incubate urban water solutions. W12 Plus is jointly run by the Institute for Ecological Stabilization based in the US and SOS, a nonprofit based in South Africa. Today's panel is part of the W12 Plus Exchange, a series of conversations to help transform experiences, research, and lessons learned and more into action for each of you here today. The purpose of today's panel is to provide a space and time for our panelists and for each of us who are concerned about the future of water in our lives. It's so easy to get caught up in our day-to-day work, yet it is so important to take the time to really imagine the kind of futures we want to build towards and interrogate how we get there. That future is one where over half of the world's population lives in an urban area. That's more than 4.5 billion people living in cities who will all need water for various purposes. Treating, delivering, and managing water for everyone, whether that's a healthcare worker, a parent, a school teacher, or a construction worker, is no small feat in the complex network that overlays and supports urban life. Last year's COP26 elevated the water world into climate talks more so than ever. It is imperative we improve water resilience for a future of increased droughts, floods, and other extreme weather-related events. We hope you come away from today's panel with one thing that you are looking forward to in the future. We hope you're able to see this one thing in your mind and to feel confident about making it a reality as you join us in answering our core question for today's panel. If you could change one thing about every city in the world to improve water and climate resilience, what would you change? Today's program will start with our three panelists who will answer this question and discuss each other's responses. We encourage you to join the conversation in the chat and to ask questions using the Google form link, which will also be in the chat. Our panelists for today are Zafar Adeel, Rebecca Ilunga, and Themba Gumbo. Zafar Adeel is the Executive Director of the Pacific Water Research Center at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. Adeel has led the development of a South-South network of scientists working in water-scarce countries, particularly focused on Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Rebecca Ilunga is based in Cape Town and is the Adaptation Network Manager for C40 Cities, a network of nearly 100 mayors from the world's leading cities working together to deliver urgent action on the climate crisis. And last but not least, we have Themba Gumbo, based in Cape Town, who is the director of CAPNet, the UNDP's global network for capacity development and sustainable water management. Themba is passionate about networking, capacity development, and empowering young people to build a career in water and environmental engineering and management. Thank you very much to our panelists for getting our conversation started today. Before we begin, I will make one more reminder about the Google form link in the chat for our Q&A session at the end of the program. You can also connect with us on social media at W12_programs. I will now pass the microphone to our moderators for today, W12 Plus Projects Director Ellie and W12 Plus Chairman Rene. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Judy. We're delighted to have our three panelists with us here today. And we are hoping for a fluent conversation where we discuss, of course, the very, very, you can say, important topic of water. And I am also delighted to introduce to you my co-host today, Ellie.
Hi, Rene. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm super excited for this conversation and to have our three panelists join us today. To get us started, I wanted to provide a little bit of context, and we did a pre-program survey to all of you who registered, and it was really interesting to look at some of the responses to that. So the majority of people who are listening in right now and who have registered are interested in learning more about water and climate resilience, are interested in thinking outside the box and imagining different possibilities for water security, and are interested in how cities are addressing water and climate challenges. So with that in mind, what we're trying to do with the structure of this panel today is to model us sitting around a table at an in-person conference, which obviously does not happen anymore, at least for a little while longer because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're trying to take a moment, take a breather, and get back up to that 1,000-foot level and think about reimagining how we're operating in the context of water in cities. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation today. It will be relatively informal. We're encouraging lots of dialogue, lots of questions, curiosity, excitement. And yeah, I'm thrilled to just turn this question back to our panelists and see where it takes us. So we'll start with Adeel, then go to Rebecca and Themba with question and answers and discussions in between. As Judy put in the chat, if you're watching on YouTube, there's a question and answer form. You also can put your questions or comments into the actual Google chat if you have access to do that. And yeah, so let's just jump into it. So Adeel, if you could change one thing about every city in the world to improve water and climate resilience, what would you change?
Great, thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Ellie, Rene, and Judy for the excellent introduction and for creating this exciting opportunity to have a meaningful discussion on how we can change the cities. Before I start with my answer, it's customary here in Canada to start by acknowledging that the lands that we are sitting on are traditional lands of the Indigenous people who never ceded these lands to anyone. And there's a number of First Nations that lay claim on the lands where Simon Fraser University operates. And these include, I'll just say the names, Semiahmoo, Ketsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Quequet, and Tsawwassen Nations. So it's always good to recognize these lands and particularly the beautiful landscape that we live on. And you can see that in my backdrop. This is pretty close to where I live. So it's a very interesting question. And before I start to answer the question, I'll just take maybe half a minute to talk about what the climate change challenges are that are facing the cities. And I think as it pertains to water, you can almost argue that water is the medium through which climate change impacts manifest themselves for cities. And they manifest in both ways, too much water and too little water. And we have seen, for example, a few years ago, both of my colleagues, Rebecca and Themba, will be very well familiar with the threat of zero day in Cape Town just a few years ago, where all the water resources were running dry. And we've also had the other end of the extreme. Just here in Vancouver last November, we had an atmospheric river event, which cut off many of the highways, and this part of Canada was cut off from the rest of the country. And also in the last 6 years or so that I've lived here in Vancouver, we've had almost every other summer has had a drought-like situation, which is exacerbated by forest fires farther west of where we are, farther east of where we are, I'm sorry. It just points to the extremes which we as environmentalists or urban planners have not really taken very well into account. So that sort of brings me to answering your question more directly. And what is it? What is the one major thing that we can do to help address these situations and improve water management? And my answer is that we need to focus on a much wider use of green infrastructure, or as it's called in a number of other places, as nature-based solutions. I think this is an approach that allows us to have a measurable and consistent improvement in water management. It builds resilience to both types of extremes. Coincidentally, both too much water and too little water can be addressed. So the kind of solutions that are in front of us have quite a wide range. So we have looked at rooftop gardens. We have rain gardens built on the ground. We have bioswales, which are a way of capturing stormwater before it rushes off, and sometimes use that to replenish the aquifers. There's also permeable pavements, which are sometimes called blue-green corridors. And what is interesting about these type of solutions is that they yield multiple types of benefits. And these benefits, first of all, start with increasing public awareness of water issues and for people to understand what the challenges are and how they can be addressed. They also provide green spaces, which are good for public health and well-being. And as we've learned in the last couple of years during the pandemic, those kind of spaces where you could go outside your house and spend some time have become really crucial to our overall well-being. But there are environmental benefits also, which is kind of where this whole movement of using nature-based solutions started. So these kind of approaches can reduce the volume of stormwater running off into the stormwater systems. And they can also increase the quality by trapping some of the sediments, trapping some of the pollutants that come through as stormwater washes off from pavements and streets. They can also increase the capacity to store water for dry spells and dry seasons. They also cut down the speed of the runoff, which means that the erosion of soils, which is a common problem in many parts of the world, also is mitigated against. And finally, they also provide protection against flooding. And there's been quite a few applications in Europe where they have looked at systematically how these kind of nature-based solutions can reduce the impacts of flooding. There is extensive experience, mostly in developed world in these kind of applications. This experience extends to different types of social and climatic settings. But I would say the experience is still emerging, and we need greater emphasis on from a policy perspective that these solutions are needed. And obviously we need corresponding investments to make these happen. And some of the work that my center has been doing is looking at the engineering design of these applications and how they can help integrate with other urban infrastructure. So I'll stop here. There's a lot more to unpack, and I'd be happy to come back and do that during our conversation.
Just as a quick follow-up on that, Adeel, do you think that to implement those kind of solutions, is it needed to have new governance or new bylaws within the city management to implement them and to actually force that development? As we know, a city is run both politically and of course also from a technical point of view of what is feasible with whatever the system they have. So would that be needed to really get that going?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, again, my center has run a series of workshops, and they were virtual during the pandemic with the municipalities. And there's about 8 or 9 municipalities here in the Vancouver region, and a few First Nations governments have taken part in that dialogue. And I think there's a very clear recognition that the policy side or the implementation side has to be reinforced with the regulatory side. So there have to be bylaws, there have to be some kind of incentivization for builders, for communities to focus on these. And there obviously eventually can also be penalties for not following the guidelines. Overall, we think that it works better when, for example, the builders who are developing communities or communities themselves and the municipal governments actually sit together and create a dialogue on what the best ways are and what the community's objectives are, what the most significant climate change threats are. So it's a fairly integrated dialogue. So it's not so much top down, but it's actually a more bottoms up approach to build consensus. Now, the other bit that I just briefly mentioned before is that typically for a municipality to implement its bylaws, you need to have engineering standards that it can impose. And that's where, at least here in this part of the world, we find that we are a bit lacking, that those engineering standards don't exist. So if you say to a builder, you must have a rain garden inside your development, it's kind of hard to exactly pinpoint what parameters and what specifications should it follow.
Adeel, I really love that, and I'm super passionate about nature-based solutions. I'm so glad that you raised that as a topic. And I suppose I had two follow-up questions. The one was, I know that you started with, an acknowledgement of the land that you're on. Do you find that you're learning a lot from the First Nations people around their relationship with nature and, how they tend to see themselves more holistically with nature and water as one? And, are there maybe lessons we can learn from how they interact with nature and water? And then the second one was around, you mentioned benefits and the health benefits. How have you found maybe that people are engaging with some of the benefits that aren't yet tangible? Great infrastructure, it's very easy to see. You have a dam and people say, oh, I can see there's a dam there. So I'd just be interested to know around the First Nations aspect and just from a benefits perspective, if there's any learnings that you guys have picked up on.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for both very interesting questions. In terms of the knowledge base of the Indigenous communities, here in Canada, that extends back to time immemorial. Indigenous communities have lived here for at least 14,000 years based on the historical records which are here. And they have been excellent stewards of nature, and they've managed to work with the natural resources and to survive and thrive. And that is the reason why some of these solutions are requiring them to be part of the dialogue and to bring their knowledge into the mix. And the obvious challenge is that because of the colonial influences and because how the development has taken place, the urban jungle is kind of one where it's now difficult to backtrack. So, for example, many of the streams that run through the Vancouver area have been paved over, so you can't even tell where they are. And there have been a couple of examples where the local community has partnered with the Indigenous community to figure out what it was originally and try to restore. The communities here are very big on the salmon populations. And so once you restore those streams, you see the salmon coming back. So it's kind of very interesting to see how that kind of knowledge can be applied to see a real measurable change at the end of the day. And your second question was?
Just on the benefits. I think with NBS, they tend to be a little bit longer term before we can see the benefits.
Right.
Lessons, yeah.
So like I said, I think the silver lining to this whole pandemic issue was that people were cramped inside their houses and there were all kinds of restrictions of movement in early 2020. But even as they were eased off, people were sort of craving for these green spaces and to be, particularly those who are in dense downtown urban type settings, they were looking to go outside and enjoy fresh air. So I think there has been an increased appreciation of these type of benefits that they bring. And some of the municipalities around our area, around the Vancouver area, have done a proactive engagement with the community. So I think they start to understand and appreciate better all what these multiple benefits are, because you have to actually explicitly state them out. Just as a footnote, I think the one element of resistance that we find is from the engineering community, and I'm an engineer by training, so I can maybe speak to it a bit. And because those engineering standards are not in place, and also because there is this mindset that, with the gray infrastructure, very well what the cost is, what the maintenance is, how long will it last, when will you need to replace it, what the maintenance costs are. And some of them, because the experience is relatively new on nature-based solutions, so there is a bit of resistance. And that's kind of where my own research is focused, is to help allay some of those concerns through a fairly systematic process.
Thank you, Adeel. If you can allow me, I've got a follow-up question as well. But first of all, just to make sure that I'm based out of Pretoria. I'm not in Cape Town. I have not arrived yet. So, I'm here in the center of Gauteng province. But just as a follow-up and also acknowledging that I'm a kind of a background of hardcore civil engineering, where it's all concrete, steel, and pipes. I do acknowledge also the fact that, most of the nature-based solutions, they don't have, easy go-to standards. And the second thing which I wanted to maybe for you to also try maybe and illustrate a little bit further is the issue that, nature-based solutions are a little bit complex to manage. So it's not like the typical, for example, if I give you a typical wastewater treatment plant from a civil engineering perspective, it's all boxed up, it's concrete, it's pumps, and it's kind of a plug and play. You hand it over to the municipality and the municipality or utility runs with it. Whilst at the same time, nature-based solutions they're supposed to, maybe manage themselves. So maybe we can illustrate that a bit as part of the disadvantage of nature-based solutions in that, they are complex to manage and there are so many moving parts also to take care of.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think those are either perceived or real disadvantages of nature-based solutions where we are now. You're quite right that the engineering standards are not easily available, although again, from on the European Union side, I think there's a lot more examples coming through. And part of the reason why those design standards are more challenging is because they are specific to the location. So because it's not just a matter of materials that you put in, but you also are integrating plants. So you want to use plants which are indigenous to the area, which are resistant to droughts, for example. And those kind of elements are where, for example, indigenous knowledge can really be helpful. But to translate all of that into, say, a package that you can hand to a contractor and say, here you go, this is what needs to be implemented. We're not quite there yet. But on the second part, I think in terms of the not having so much of a plug and play nature and not knowing the long-term maintenance costs, I think the underlying knowledge base is actually emerging quite rapidly, and there's quite a few researchers around the world who are working with these cities to describe those kind of details. And our general understanding is based on those studies is that the cost of maintenance is lower compared to your concrete structures. The initial capital investment is also lower. The sort of the unknown part sometimes is that how frequently do you need to go in and change, for example, some of the substrate or the underlying materials underneath the plants? So, again, that is a very location-specific answer. I'll maybe add one minor footnote that for most of the urbanized areas around the world, the infrastructure, I'm particularly thinking of stormwater and sewage systems, they have been designed maybe at least 40, 50 years ago. In some of the older urban areas, they're 100 or 150 years old. And it's not really practical now to go back and start to redo all of them for an increase of water, because the rainfall intensity, we know, because of climate change, even in the dry areas, has gone up quite considerably. So you're getting sharper rainfall events in a shorter period of time. And so these nature-based solutions provide you a solution to not having to expand your steel and concrete infrastructure, because in a dense urban environment, that's very difficult and very expensive to do in the first place.
Thank you all. This was a great first round of engagement, and I've got almost a page of notes on my side, so I think it's great. Let's now transition to Rebecca. And as you recall, we've asked all three panelists the same exact question. So Rebecca, if you could change one thing about every city in the world to improve water and climate resilience, what would you change?
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, Adeel, for opening the conversation and the floor so wonderfully. I think for me, it really requires a big paradigm shift from being reactive to being proactive. And one of the quickest ways or most efficient ways I think cities have to do this is to develop clear and holistic water security visions and strategies. And these visions should have a way to be mainstreamed into a lot of land use policies and planning policies, and into more impactful decision-making processes. So looking beyond just reacting when there's a flood, reacting when there's a drought, and actually planning, what do we do when our population grows? What do we do with the finances that we currently have and the finances that we need? And that touches on what Adeel mentioned about nature-based solutions. How do we plan for that? Do we have enough resources for that going forward? And I think the most prime example is what the city of Cape Town went through during day zero, which we mentioned at the beginning, was did they have a plan going forward? Now they do. But I think if a lot more cities kind of get to the point of actually knowing how much water will be needed, how they're going to actually get that water in the future, and how do they mainstream that plan across sectors and break down some of the silos between their teams, that's probably the most efficient way going forward from my perspective.
That's great. Thank you. Adeel, Themba, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I like your point about using holistic policies. And, in many cases, that only happens sporadically, and you sometimes need a bit of leadership. I don't know if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on what the ingredients are that can lead up to that holistic outcome.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not saying I have the ultimate recipe, but I think just from our discussions at C40 with some of the cities, the one thing that we're really finding is actually just establishing a baseline. A lot of cities don't know where they currently are, and it's very difficult to get to where you're going if you don't know where you are. So some organizations that are doing that, I mean, I know the CRC for water sensitive cities, they kind of help cities to benchmark where are they in terms of all these different silos of water management. So whether it's wastewater, whether it's stormwater, whether it's their governance, whether it's their financing, and taking a more holistic approach of establishing, okay, where we are. And then going forward, well, how do we actually look at, accounting for circularity within our vision? How do we bring the right stakeholders to the table? So whether it's the private sector, whether it's academic institutions, actually getting that input from people that might think differently. I do think it will require a shift and breaking down that barrier between the public and the private. There will definitely need to be a lot more collaboration with the private sector. I think they have a lot to bring to the table in terms of innovation. But even within cities themselves, there's often a shift between, the political agenda and the technical team's agenda. And trying to align those two is going to be critical going forward. The political teams tend to change every 5 or so years, whereas the technical teams stay, and they're the ones who have to deal with these challenges. So making sure that some of those KPIs and those initiatives are actually striving to achieve the same thing. And then within the technical teams themselves, are they speaking to each other? Often we speak to our cities and they say, oh no, stormwater, they're doing their own thing. I'm focusing on droughts. I just deal with the drought data and the drought information. And we're kind of saying, well, this is one system. Water is passing through from one sector to the other. We need to have a better understanding across the board. It will obviously require a lot of data and information. And I think, once again, the Cape Town example, but also, in cities like Singapore, just knowing what you actually have available is critical, and actually ensuring that you have data strategies and information strategies that are up to date and maintained and are accessible to different teams across the board is also definitely going to be critical. So just some ingredients, what that cake looks like at the end, I'm not really sure yet. But I think if you have the right ingredients to start off with, you're bound to make a good cake, regardless of how you put them together. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a pretty comprehensive list. Yeah, and I would agree pretty much with everything. I think the investment part and also gathering the data and information, I think, are challenging starting points in many cases.
I have a follow-up, Rebecca. I think apologies to the international audience. I'm bringing this subject, I think, closer to home here in South Africa, and of course, Rebecca being in the opposite town, in Cape Town. One of the latest reports, I think, coming from South Africa, and also one from the World Bank, which I noticed, is that close to about 65% of the municipalities in South Africa are dysfunctional. So that allows me to, think about, what can change and how can innovation come in. What's your take in terms of, mobilizing the youth, and also maybe mobilizing the, women, and give it more a stronger gender lens, and not just to talk to the usual suspects? I'm not quite sure about the dynamics in Cape Town, but I think maybe you can talk in broader terms, and maybe try and demonstrate, whether that can disrupt the status quo and bring the change that we need.
No, definitely. I completely agree. I think going forward, inclusivity is going to be paramount. I don't think there'll be any progress without some kind of inclusive climate action. And water is not separate from that. As Adeel mentioned, the water crisis and the climate crisis are one and the same. So youth have a big role to play. I mean, at the Stockholm World Water Week last year, there was a big progress from the youth, and just kind of them having a voice and kind of shifting how we think about things. Often, I also come from an engineering background. It's very easy to think that we have the solution coming in and saying, well, we know best, we've studied this, we have the experience. I think youth are coming at it from a completely different perspective. They have a passion for, the world that they're going to have to inherit one day. And they definitely deserve a voice in the conversation. And I know that a lot of cities that are now starting to embark on kind of a strategic perspective for how to manage water security are looking at involving the youth more. Women as well. I mean, especially in a lot of disadvantaged communities, they spend a lot of time actually collecting the water. They understand how long it takes, what it actually requires to run a household, and multiply that by however many households there are, and you get an idea of what it takes to run a city in terms of collecting water and what's available and how accessible it is, but also from a quality perspective. So I don't think this conversation in terms of achieving water security and cities being resilient going forward can happen without an inclusivity lens. So I definitely think that's going to be paramount. In terms of innovation, just coming back to that point as well, I think I'm so glad you brought that word up. There's so much, I think, out there that we just need to explore, and it does take a bit of a shift in terms of how people think about water. We need to stop seeing this wicked problem as a bad thing. We have actually an opportunity to come up with new ways of handling this. And if people can get to a stage of embracing the complexity and not seeing it as something that needs to be, in a neat box, it's going to look different. Adeel mentioned adaptation and resilience looks different in context. And the sooner people can adapt or choose a solution that best suits their context, the better it is for the broader population. It can't look the same in every single city. So people embracing that complexity of the differentiation will also be critical. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I have a follow-up question, but I think I might hold it until the end because I want to get on to hear Themba's response. And I think my question will still be relevant at that point. So Themba, now, last but certainly not least, if you could change one thing about every city in the world to improve water and climate resilience, what would you change?
Thank you, Ellie. Maybe I can start off by saying, maybe I can use some makeup. Okay, that's easy, but sorry, that's a joke. Look, of course, this discussion is about one thing, right? So I had to think deeper and wider on what cities can do, because a city is, as we had also from the opening remarks by Adeel, a city is I call it a an organism, right? And it's associated with flows of material and energy, and there's people inside. What I'm proposing in terms of what one thing can change is that cities become a little bit much more smarter in terms of how they approach things, and agreeing also with Rebecca, bringing in innovation, which relies on people for insights and direction, and also including best practices from elsewhere, with technology amplifying this, not the other way around, of course. Of course, smart cities concept is not a new concept. In ancient times, we have seen that, we've had, for example, the ancient city of Petra at the height of its splendor in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, which first built by the Nabateans around 300 BC. It later became the capital city of the Roman frontier province, Arabia Petraea, in 106 AD, flourishing for the next 2 centuries into the heart of the desert. So what one can see is that what is new with 21st century kind of cities moving forward. Of course, there is an interesting thread which is new, and that thread is very much writing, I think, on the question of advances in ICT, information, communication, and technology. I think if one looks back, maybe back in the early 90s, 1990s, moving up to where we are, we've seen tremendous growth in the use of new technologies, and some of those technologies are related to how we gather information, how we process information, and also how we communicate that information. And I want to just emphasize that also it's not just technology. I think the people are at the center of this, and also governance issues are at the center of this. That's why some of you maybe at times hear issues related to e-governance. I can come to those in later on to unpack. But as an example, just 2 years ago, here in Pretoria, I do receive emails every month from the mayor, giving each and every citizen who's got an email an update of what is going on. So I'm well informed. I've got access to the mayor if I want to. I've got also access to the councillor. I've got the phone number of the councillor of my neighborhood. So that on its own, it means I can hold the office bearers to account much more easier than before, because of the availability of technology. Of course, smart cities have got a number of elements, and they do touch on, we know that water is the most important element of a smart city, of course, but they do touch in, as I've mentioned, a city, you should look at it as an organism. It touches also on smart energy, smart mobility, smart public services, smart water, smart buildings and homes, and also smart integration. And the whole concept, of course, is a little bit, if you like, quite broad, and I will understand why also there's a bit of inertia in embarking in such a process for most of the cities, because it requires quite a lot of fundamental rethinking. It requires resources. It requires some bit of visioning into the future of what kind of city you are envisaging. And just to add that, generally, I've been also working in the water space for more than 30 years now. And the water people, I've got some bit of inertia, or the whole water sector, might put it that way, has got some inertia on using new technologies as maybe compared to other sectors like transport, even health sector and so on. There's the institutions that are normally charged with, for example, managing water or municipalities, they are using some traditional and maybe, conventional ways which are a little bit outdated. And I experience that, I think, on my day-to-day life, if I have to maybe visit some of the municipalities in and around here in Pretoria. You don't get the information that you need, on the go. And what the inertia is also that there's not a strong will to, for example, jump onto these new technologies, use of sensors, use of mobile phone technologies, for example, for easier communication. And also, investing in infrastructure which can be used to process and also store data for the better of all the citizenry. I'll stop here and I'll maybe invite some, some discussions into this whole smart city idea, and where maybe there are bottlenecks, and also where there may be advantages in moving forward.
Thanks, Themba. I'll jump in with a question. First of all, thank you for giving a comprehensive overview of what a smart city would look like. And I like your idea of using e-governance to increase accountability and thinking through and rethinking perhaps to get over this inertia. But I want to zoom into this notion of responding to climate change and the balance between mitigation in terms of emissions that come from the city versus adaptation and resilience building. What we see in a lot of cities is that there is, when you talk about climate change policies and investment, there is a lot of attention being paid to reducing of emissions, which is certainly important, but the adaptation side sort of lags behind a little bit. I don't know if you have the same experience in your work, but how to bring about this balance that you can't drop one for the other, but you also need to have a balance to say, yes, we need to have an energy smart city with good transportation, with the building sector bringing in some smart energy solutions. But then what about the other side?
Yeah, thank you, Adeel. Maybe I'll try to answer you by bringing in a word here, which needs to be, which is important in managing any of these smart city systems. The word is efficiency, and efficiency is key here. If you mentioned, I think in one of your statements that most of the, for example, water infrastructure which we have in most cities is about 50 years old, give or take, or maybe say, yeah. So if one looks back, if one had to go back and say, look, can I really come back and redesign that same pump which was designed 50 years ago? What efficiency gains can I get out of them, and what how much savings can I come up with in terms of making sure that that pump is sized properly, and it's not only pumping maybe continuously all the time, but that it's optimized to only pump when it is required. And this is where I think the whole thing is interconnected somehow. One can look at, say, oh, okay, where I'm here in Pretoria, we get our energy from the coal, just not far from here, about 40 kilometers from the coal mines. But where is that energy going? There are a lot of losses along the way, whilst at the same time we're polluting the air. So in terms of adaptation, there are many ways which this energy and water link can come to bear to come up with much more efficient designs which conserve energy and also at the same time conserve water, because the two are always very much intertwined when you look at how normal cities operate. And I think the underlying thing for you to be able to have those efficiency gains, you have to be have the information which can lead you to the correct decision making, and also be able to convince, I think, the city leaders or the mayors that this is the way to go. So efficiency, I think, is crucial in this case.
Well, thank you very much for pointing that out. I think that's a great answer. Because we know at a global scale, about 8% of the energy consumed is used for treating and pumping water and wastewater. So any efficiency gains in that 8% is going to lead to reduced carbon emissions. So that's great. And I agree with you that for selling this to municipal leadership, the moment you say it's going to benefit your bottom line, I think everyone is paying attention to it. So thanks. That's a great answer.
Thank you, Adeel, for raising that, because I often think there's a bit of a miscommunication between the mitigation and adaptation lenses. But Themba, I suppose my question maybe steers a little bit away from the climate lens and looks at the concept of, it's great from an innovation perspective and a decentralization perspective to have these smart cities, but how do we think around things like hacking? I mean, I know the US has really thought about, okay, we have now this technical system or this model that basically runs our entire city. Does it introduce other types of vulnerabilities that maybe we haven't yet considered that aren't climate vulnerabilities that could be a challenge going forward?
Yeah, that's a reality, and I don't want to sound a bit, hacking will always be there, and it's one of those maybe which I can call also, a pandemic which will always be there. There are ways of getting around that. We cannot avoid that. We've seen it maybe in the banking sector, for example. Only 5 years ago, internet banking was big. But now, you bank through your phone, and you do everything through your smartphone. And, there are things, of course, happening, but because the banking sector ensures, because there's money involved, money flows involved, ensures that, that information and data is protected, and it's well firewalled. But at the same time, let me give you the other side of it. The other side of it is that public sector institutions like municipalities, also dealing with water and wastewater and so on, have traditionally been, gatekeepers. They want to keep the information to themselves, and there is little or fewer examples where this information has been, communicated to the public. Again, for international audience, we know one of the problems that we have here in South Africa is the question of, corruption in the water sector. And if you want to be corrupt, you have to try and hide as much information as possible, especially if you're a public office bearer, and you don't want the information to leak to the public, because the public will ask you, why are you building a second pipeline when you have not fixed the one which is leaking? It's because a new pipeline, of course, comes with more investments, and then more money also for the back pocket. So in coming up with the balance between the information sharing, I think there's to be a balance. Of course, there is some sensitive information which needs to be protected, but to a large extent, some of the information should also be a public good.
No, great. Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you that it will be critical to disseminate a lot of that information and almost make it accessible to communities for water to be better managed going forward.
Yeah, I think it's excellent, Themba. I just have one question I would like to jump back to that you mentioned earlier on. You were talking a lot about best practice and learning from city to city, and therefore, of course, have engagement. How do you see an effective way of that peer-to-peer acknowledgement and interaction, where cities are actually having a direct line to each other, of communicating, where they sit with similar issues, similar problems, and then also, of course, once they have solved something, there needs to be a big shout of like, we have actually come up with some brilliant solutions, both from a technical point of view, but it can also be with engagement to civil society. How do you see that kind of communication can be effective, and how would you suggest that we would overcome the challenges that there is right now, that there is no official link, you can say?
Thank you for that follow-up question. And of course, acknowledging also Rebecca, she was for the C40 initiative, cities, which are also connected somehow, maybe looking much more at, climate change issues. Within, I work for a program which is under the UN system, UNDP, and we work very closely with a program under UN Habitat, which is called GWOPA, Global Water Operators Partnership Alliance, which promotes, the twinning, and also promotes the learning from each other, South-South learning, and also North-South learning from each other, and try to pick up some of the best practices which are ongoing. And if resources are available, especially financial resources, they do also, fund, exchange visits, where, the exchange staff, to spend time where maybe, the best in class kind of municipality or utility has been identified. So there are a number of avenues, I think, in place already to foster that kind of learning. And within here also, in where I'm sitting in Pretoria, I know there are a number of some of the municipalities are not well endowed in terms of maybe staff resources, and also in terms of their revenues. So they tend to lean maybe and learn a little bit more on those other municipalities which have got better resources. It doesn't have to be another player who's far from each other. It can be actually be next door. So the ability is the trick to this is that whether the different municipalities also are ready to learn and also to unlearn some of the practices that they've been doing, which are not maybe beneficial. The problem with the most, which hinders this, is that municipalities and water utilities in general in the urban setting have no time to learn. Most of their time is firefighting. It's firefighting here, firefighting there, and then they don't reflect and learn not only from themselves, but also to learn from others. But whilst at the same time, there's a wealth of information out there where municipalities can learn. So in brief, there is a platform like that, and there are also local platforms globally, which is the GWOPA program, which I mentioned. And also there are other global platforms like, the International Water Association, but also there are regional and local platforms where also, the best practices can be harvested, and then they can be replicated or upscaled.
I mean, I'd love to add on Themba's point, Rene. I think cities are really going to be at the forefront of change going forward. I mean, it's where a lot of the GDP lies. People are going to migrate to cities going forward, given the climate crisis, but also for economic reasons. So I think the fact that cities are kind of pioneering in a lot of the innovations that will actually lead to more sustainable and resilient cities going forward really encourages the peer-to-peer exchange. And, as Themba mentioned at C40, it is something that we try and prioritize, and I know W12 Plus is doing it as well. How do we actually share best case studies? How do we ensure that people aren't reinventing the wheel every time they're trying to implement a solution? The resources are out there. It's just about creating access and almost clear flow of communication between the cities. And it does come back to Themba's point about them not putting out fires. So them being proactive and saying, we might not be facing this challenge yet, but let's go and learn about a city that's done it well, because it could be one of the challenges that we're facing in future. We don't necessarily need to invest a whole bunch of finances into it, and we don't necessarily need to, start building this infrastructure that we might never need, but let's know what a solution could look like in a different context that's maybe not yet within our own, realm, but in the future it could be. So I really think it's going to be critical for cities to engage in some kind of exchange of learning going forward.
Thank you, Rebecca. Totally agreed. We are going to wrap up shortly, but I do have one question from the audience that I would love just to hear brief responses to, because I think it does sort of capture a lot of the conversations we've been having in a relatively succinct way. So I'll put it just in the chat for those on Zoom so you can see it, and I'll also read it out to everybody. So this question is from Larry Swatuk, who I think several of you know. So Larry's question is, nature-based solutions can operate at local scales, i.e. greening brownfields. He has a pet theory that this can enhance citizen governance relations, local action for social democracy. Is he dreaming, or is this a possibility? I'd love to hear responses.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Larry, for always these interesting questions. And no, you're not dreaming. I think these type of solutions, as you correctly point out, are applied on local scales. And I think the kind of conversations, at least in these series of workshops that I mentioned earlier with the municipal governments, I think there is a much greater recognition that for success of any of these applications, you have to engage with the community members, with the, wherever you're implementing these solutions. And sometimes you can even enhance or encourage a much broader dialogue at the city level. And so, yes, if it's done correctly, it can enhance these relationships between municipal governments and the communities they serve. What I also see, and I'll use again maybe Vancouver as an example, that you oftentimes find at least one or two council members in the municipal government who are very keen and are gung-ho on pushing through with these type of solutions. And I think they can actually help push the envelope even more in both, on the one side, bringing communities and public voices onto the mainstream, and on the other side, pushing the engineering side or the more traditional, concrete and steel type of approaches to actually lean a little bit more in the direction of nature-based solutions. So having those political champions inside the cities, I think, is a great way to actually make it happen. And I'll say realistically, it won't happen everywhere at the same time. So even within these 8 or 9 municipalities here in the Vancouver metro area, we know that there are great disparities, but you see still the general direction is the same.
That's very true, Adeel. I wanted to also thank you, Larry, for that question. Also wanted to share maybe, of course, Larry and everyone else can look it up. The project which has impressed me in the past few years is the River of Life in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. This is the river which is running down through the city. And for it to be, to remove all the pollution and stop the pollution taking place and the river being taken up by, the social, undesirable social misfits and so on, they've embarked on a very comprehensive program to get the river back. That's why it's called the River of Life. And it does require, I think, the engagement of the government and the citizens. And they have to come together to realize that the outcome is of benefit to all. The last time I checked, or the last time I was there, the river had transformed itself to some extent. And those who have been polluting they didn't need to be policed after all. So they were stopping the pollution, some of the restaurants and so on. They were actually doing the action on their own because it did relate to life in Kuala Lumpur. It's bringing back life. So these are some of the, I think, examples, the one which comes into my head, which can be used, I think, here to mobilize and to illustrate that, you know, it's we're all in it together, whether you're government or a citizen.
Thank you all. This was an absolutely fantastic conversation. I've learned so much. I feel a bit refreshed having just taken a moment to get back to that 1,000-foot perspective. A few brief observations as we wrap out, and thank you all for sticking with us. I know we're a couple of minutes over time, but I think it was worth it. So we've talked about balancing these contextually specific interventions, these very localized examples of interventions with replication and bringing things to scale in order to meet this imminent need for water security for all, and balancing that with climate resilient development, avoiding reinventing the wheel, stop putting fires out. We also all talked about putting people first and centering people across in all of your responses. So whether it's engineers meeting with community members to identify visions for nature-based solutions to make sure that these interventions meet real challenges, to center people in terms of inclusivity of gender, age, and other marginalized demographics. That's central to a long-term sustainable intervention. And that people are central to governance, citizen government relations. We also talked about expanding the focus from these specific interventions to reframing the way we approach the issue, a broader paradigm shift of how we're approaching water security. And a question that I'm left with today that I'd love people just to ponder, and feel free to engage with us in the future on, is how we incentivize that level of a transition. I mean, it's relatively simple. When we talked about incentivization earlier, when we talk about it from a more transactional perspective to incentivize specific interventions, but it's a bit more complicated when you talk about incentivizing a paradigm shift. What does that look like? How does that play out in the world, and what could we do more of? So as Rebecca said earlier today, I wrote this down because I thought it was a brilliant little quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I'll leave you with this thought. Stop seeing this wicked problem of water insecurity as a bad thing. Embrace the complexity, and it doesn't need to be in a neat box. There are opportunities. So at W12, we always try to embrace hope as the sort of core central message to what we're doing. And I hope that this conversation has left you with hope. So thank you all for joining us, and please do follow along with us with W12 and all of the organizations represented here today. We will put a post-event survey in the chat on the YouTube chat, and please fill that out. We'd love to hear feedback, thoughts on future conversation topics, panelists, etc. And yeah, thank you all. Have a lovely day. Huge thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone.
Bye-bye for now.